Welcome to the Diocese of Madison This Week on Relevant Radio 1240 AM and 97.3 FM.
Thank you for joining us for the Diocese of Madison This Week on Relevant Radio. I am Deacon Jim Hoegemeier, a permanent deacon of the Diocese of Madison, assigned to All Saints Parish in Berlin. I also serve as Associate Director of the Apostolate for Persons with Disabilities of the Diocese of Madison. So after a break from being in Rome to meet with Pope Francis and a very active week after returning from Rome, we celebrate the return of our host, Bishop Donald Hying, the Bishop of Madison. Welcome, Bishop Hying.
Yeah, thank you so much, Deacon Jim. I just want to wish all of our listeners a happy and blessed 2020. We're in a new year, but also a new decade, and it just gives us a chance to ponder the gift of time and the mystery of our lives, redeemed by Christ.
Well, given that this is the first part of the new year, this show is going to be one of many firsts. For the first time in the illustrious history of this program, we have an in-studio guest. And also for the first time, we have a studio audience, primarily because of our guest. And I think for the first time, we have all three ranks of holy orders represented with a deacon, a priest, and a bishop. Now, our guest this morning is Father Matthew Schneider, a priest member of the Legionaries of Christ, who currently resides in Pennsylvania and is completing a doctoral program with the intention of being perhaps a seminary professor and or a writer. So welcome, Father Matthew.
Thank you.
It's a joy that you're with us, Father. Thank you for being on our show today.
Thank you, Bishop.
Now, along with Kayla Sheezer, who is my colleague at the Apostolate for Persons with Disabilities, I had the opportunity to meet Father Matthew at an event in November near Washington, D.C., which was coordinated by the National Catholic Partnership on Disability. And that's an organization that's closely connected with the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and they focus on efforts like the Apostolate for Persons with Disabilities in our diocese, efforts to make sure that all people, regardless of any physical conditions or challenges, have the opportunity to be full participants in the life of the Church. And in talking with Father Matthew, I discovered that he spends some time during holiday seasons at Oaklawn Academy, which is an international boarding school in Edgerton, kind of just south of Madison, operated by the Legionaries of Christ. So I invited him to share his amazing experience and ministry with all of us through this program. And maybe, Father Matthew, certainly when priests are on programs like these, the standard question, well, could you share your vocation story?
So I grew up in Canada, Calgary, Alberta to be precise, which is north of Montana, for those who are not familiar with Canadian geography. And I'm the oldest of four. I have three sisters. All of them live up in Calgary with my parents, on the same street, actually. Well, the youngest one is still in her 20s and single, so she still lives at my parents' house. The other two have houses just down the road. And when I was in college, I really started thinking about the priesthood as a possibility, just in the sense that I had a very strong conversion experience late in high school, and I started thinking, maybe God is using this to call me the priesthood or something. But I still went on to study electrical computer engineering, which is, I have a family, a lot of engineers, a lot of chemistry type people. But then during the second year of college, I was listening to John Paul II. And I just had this inspiration that God, kind of clearly, that God wanted me to be a priest. And so with that, I started looking at the different options. I looked at the Legionaries of Christ. I went to the Diocesan Vocation Days. I looked at another number of other communities. I didn't end up visiting any of them. And when I visited the Legionaries of Christ, I really just kind of fell in love with that vocation. And then I went through all of the formation. That would have been in 2001. And then I was only ordained in 2013 because the Legionaries have kind of a longer formation program. One of the biggest differences is we have 4 years, I had 4 pastoral years versus, one that Dawson seminarians usually have. Now we generally do 2 or 3. Back when I was there 2006, 2010, it was generally 3 or 4. So I ended up on the 4. And so I was, and then I was ordained in 2013 in Rome, in St. John Lateran by Cardinal Vlassio de Paulus. And since then, I've been in different ministries of the community here in North America.
So probably the main reason you're here is I'd like to talk about, I know a significant event happened on April 2nd of 2019, last year, and I know that we can talk about things that led up to that, but what took place on that day?
So on April 2nd, which is World Autism Awareness Day, I became public about being diagnosed with autism. And so I think it's a little bit to go back to understand why. So I always was like a little bit different, a little bit kind of quirky or things like that, but I never thought it was, that serious. I just thought, okay, I don't fit in 100%, but a lot of people don't fit in 100%. So, but what happened was my first year after ordination, when I was ordained in 2013, I was assigned as a school chaplain with the community. Pretty normal assignment for a new priest. But, and I was assigned to be there for 3 years. But after 1 year, they're like, no, we don't want you back. And I was like, what did I do wrong? I mean, I know I made a few mistakes, but I was like, everybody makes a few mistakes learning a new ministry in that. And I didn't think any of them were like, huge disasters. But it turned out that what it was I was just not reading all the emotional signs of all the kids, like in a school environment where there's a lot of understanding not just what the kids are saying, but what they mean by their kind of body language and things like that, which is where they suggested maybe there's something with autism. It ended up about a year later, I was diagnosed while I was working kind of behind the scenes for the community as my main ministry, doing a part-time licentiate, which is kind of between a master's and a doctoral degree in theology. And so I was diagnosed about a year after that by a psychologist in the DC area. And it just at first it was kind of like, I was kind of shocked. I was kind of like, oh man, this is horrible. Like as I'm driving home from the appointment after I got diagnosed, and usually you think of diagnosis as a kid, which is usually a little bit shorter, I think, as far as time-wise. But as an adult, the diagnosis, you go in several times for 3-4 hours, maybe like 12, 15 hours of testing or something. I don't remember the exact amount, but something along those lines. And then all the testing comes back, and then you come back and they give you what they see and everything. And after I was going home for that final appointment, I was kind of pretty down on myself. But what I found out as I started reading up on autism, I started to realize, okay, that difference I have, that quirkiness I have, oh, that makes sense. Now I understand this. Now I understand that. And I realized, okay, like I have these strengths and these weaknesses. And okay, well, I can keep trying to work on these, and I shouldn't just say, okay, it's hard for me to read other people's emotion, therefore I'm just not going to try. But I have to also realize that because I'm doing that with a lot more conscious effort, where everyone else is doing that subconsciously, I'm never going to be as good as an average person in that regard. That's just not going to be something that I'm going to be, just come naturally to me. It's just like, if you're 5 feet tall, you're not going to be a basketball center. You could be, you can try, but if you want to, you can maybe play like guard or something. But if you're 5 feet tall, you're not going to make a good center. And it's those type of things. Yet I started to realize, and I said, okay, yeah, I have to, and that was really, and so thinking about that. So that was a few years beforehand, and then I lived, with that in secret. But only a few months after, I started thinking, I have to be public about this for two reasons. First of all, for myself, in that sense that when certain things come out that, oh, I'm quirky or oh this, and it's kind of like people are awkward. They're like, oh, he's just autistic, and then they have an explanation. It doesn't feel like a complete, like I'm intentionally being rude or I'm intentionally being awkward. It's just like, I'm sorry, I wasn't unintentionally did something that is considered rude. I didn't mean it. I'm trying to be nice. But also, I thought there is a need for a ministry towards people on the spectrum, because like all the data says about 1.5% to 2%, depending on which exact study you read, of people are autistic. So, and we need people who come out and talk about it from their own experience to be able to minister to them. Because if you just, we can't do some ministry from outside, and there are a number of people who've done a lot of great ministry like that. But I think that there's something, when you are also autistic and that's the way you think, that gives a certain advantage doing that type of ministry. And I think, and I realize that there's a need for that, and I can't really do that without being public about it. So this year on April 2nd, I announced it publicly, and it went pretty wide. I mean, it was in Catholic News Agency and Crooks and a number of other, major Catholic publications, things like that.
Sounds like it was both a consolation, a challenge, your discovery of autism, Father, that it helped you understand yourself and explain certain things, but also just the challenge of embracing that, I would think, is also a moment of discovery where it's trusting in God's grace, trusting that you're a priest, trusting that you have abilities, and to embrace the fact that you were diagnosed with autism, but also to not let that define you or to be put into a category, I would think. It seems to me that you hear more and more about people, especially children that have some degree of autism. Would there be more autistic folks, or is it just that we hear about it more? What do you think?
Well, I don't know. I know that a huge portion and the majority of the increase is we know about it, we diagnose it more. Like even looking at my own story, there's one or two times in my childhood in the 80s and early 90s when if we had the diagnostic criteria of 2015, I would have been diagnosed in the 80s. They didn't
have the tools yet to do that.
Well, they didn't have the tools, but also the criteria that we understood it as. If you look at the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the official manual for psychologists, and you look at how it's changed, is that when they had it as like 1 in 10,000, it's like you had to check 10 boxes. Whereas today we realize if you check 6 of those 10 boxes, you're actually autistic. You don't need to check every single one of those. And so there's things like that, which, a much larger portion of the population is going to check 6 boxes than 10 boxes on a 10 box survey. And so things like that, I think that the most part of it, I don't know if there's some growth, but I know the vast majority of the increase is definitely but greater awareness and the change of the diagnostic criteria as well in that regard.
Yeah, recognition that there's varying degrees of autism.
Yeah,
That's right.
I mean it's different. I think there's different degrees in how much help someone needs to live, as an autistic, and there's also different comorbid conditions, because one of the things back in the 80s was to be diagnosed, you had to have intellectual disability, and I mean, as Deacon mentioned at the beginning, I'm studying a doctorate degree. I do not have any intellectual disabilities. And so that's one of those things where we change it and we realize, okay, there can be somebody who's autistic who doesn't have intellectual disabilities, and intellectual disability is a second condition. There is a higher percentage of autistics who also have intellectual disabilities, significantly higher than the general population. But that doesn't mean those are two separate diagnoses that just happen to be, in many cases, concurrent, but are not the same thing. One of the things you mentioned is just like kind of embracing it. And I think one of the things that really helped me out was one of the things that one of the priests in my community said to me not long after I'd been diagnosed, because he said, one of our biggest challenges in our spiritual life is always to recognize our own crosses and recognize exactly what our crosses are so we can carry them better. And he said, he basically said, look, you now that you've been diagnosed, you know what a huge portion of your cross is, and that's a help for you to go forward spiritually, that, okay, this is going to be difficult. These aspects are going to be difficult for you. And that's not going to be something that just, you do a class, something, and all of a sudden it's no longer difficult. So I think that things like that also have been very much helpful in embracing it.
You are listening to the Diocese of Madison This Week on Relevant Radio. I'm Deacon Jim Hoegemeier, joined in studio by our host, Bishop Donald Hying, and our guest, Father Matthew Schneider, an autistic priest. And we're just having a fascinating discussion about Father Matthew's experience with receiving a diagnosis of autism after he was ordained.
Yes.
And talking about how that has an impact on him, how it might impact his ministry. And one question I had is, when you received that initial diagnosis, how did your brothers and the Legionaries of Christ, how did that impact them?
Well, I think it impacted them in different ways. So I was open with those in my local community fairly soon on, but it was a very limited circle who knew. It was the provincial superiors, basically kind of like the equivalent of a bishop for a diocesan priest, and those who are in the local community. And they really kind of accepted it. I think sometimes it's still sometimes they kind of accept it in the sense that they understand, okay, he's autistic, but even still, I'm not sure how much every single one always understands it, because it's, just like anything else, that people have a vague understanding of it, but it's very different. It's very different, like the average person understanding of it, and somebody like myself who's read, like a whole library of books on the topic, and different aspects that, like even recently, one of them was asking me, like, so what does autism mean and things, and I think slowly that, and I have not received any kind of pushback from them. My provincial was very much in the sense of, it's up to you how much you want to be public about this. And even like we were talking about the doctoral thesis, one of the things, that part of that was thinking about myself and talking with the provincial and discerning and saying, okay, like where am I going to fit best in ministry? Because in the Legion, we do a lot of our ministry is things like spiritual direction retreats and schools and youth ministry. And all of those are going to, somebody who's autistic is going to come with a significant obstacle to that. Versus, somebody in a seminary, obviously there's still social interaction and there can still be slight mistakes, but the difficulties of autism don't as dramatically affect a job like teaching in a seminary as they might affect, spiritual direction of, helping out a mom who just lost her kid, or who's struggling with marital issues or something, who comes to you to kind of talk one-on-one.
So have you had the experience where Father Matthew and I were talking before about some of the charisms of the Legionaries of Christ, and a strong focus on, for the salvation of souls, but with a focus on young people.
Yes.
Youth ministry, operating schools. And I would imagine some of your brother priests and brothers, and really anybody in the community, now that they know of your experience with autism, do they come to you and ask, I'm working with this person that I think has autism, how can I most effectively minister for them using your gifts and experience?
Well, I think actually, like we start off with, that I'm coming to the academy here for our kind of the equivalent of our like diocesan convocation, where we meet up all over the province. I'm expecting a bunch of them to come up to me now, because I was only public about this with a small group within them before I was public with the whole world back in early 2019, and I haven't met up with most of them. Most of the priests I only see like once a year for the week after Easter, after Christmas. A few priests have come up to me and asked me, whether by email or phone call or things like that afterwards, both in my community, a few other priests who I've known in other ways, like for instance, I did my licentiate at Sacred Heart in Detroit, and one of the priests who was a student with me there, who's a diocesan priest, sent me a message and said, hey, I have this student here that he's a chaplain to a high school, and he asked me some questions about that. So,
have many people approached you, Father, like either through social media or in person, who would feel comfortable bringing up their struggle with autism, knowing that you've gone public with yours?
Definitely. I get a number of people sending me messages on social media about kind of either their own living with autism and the difficulties that entails, or having a kid who's autistic and the difficulties that entails. Most of it so far has been more one-on-one via social media or via other kind of, or via the blog I have has like a contact form that comes to my email. I've gotten a few through there too, and things like that. So that's where I've had a decent number. The oddest one was actually somebody I knew back in elementary school, who's a kid, someone in my class. The first day I came out, she sent me a message because her son is autistic, and we'd fallen out of touch. We hadn't talked since like middle school. We were in the same class all the way through like elementary school, but we'd just gone to different high schools for various reasons. And then, we were friends in elementary school, but you don't keep up with everybody who's in your class. And she had found, like, when I became public, it had gotten through some parents group on Facebook that she was part of and it came back. She's like, wait a second. I know this guy.
That's great.
and that's really, that was one of the most interesting ones. And just, that.
Mm-hmm.
It's a reminder that ministry is all about relationships.
Really?
And relationships that you might not think. even exist, or maybe do exist but haven't existed for a while, all of a sudden there's something that happens in each of our lives that somehow connects us to people, maybe people from our past, but also people that are going to come in and be part of our future.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a lot to do, with that. And I think we have all those relationships, and that's really important. And I think you're right in that sense. In all the different relationships, I think one of the things about autistics is that we have, one of the things they found is that a lot of times we relate in a way that other autistics understand better than other non-autistics, other normal, like neurotypicals or average normal kind of people, however you want to put it. And so sometimes you see it in certain, groups on Facebook, or there's different message boards. Like there's a few message boards online that are run, by and for autistics, and you see a very different you see a slightly different way of relating, but everyone there kind of clicks in that way of relating in a way that, an average person might click relating, going to the local pub or something.
I think our conversation opens up a wider discussion regarding how people that have psychological struggles of various kinds, find a place within the church.
Yeah.
And I think oftentimes folks experience rejection on the level of the parish because they don't fit in, or somebody doesn't want that person on parish council, or they're misunderstood. So they come to the church looking for acceptance, looking for community, looking for connection, because they think, well, church will be different than society. Church will be different than my workplace. And I think it demands a greater sensitivity and understanding from everyone within the church, that everyone has a place within the church. And how do we have a more welcoming, understanding attitude, I think, regarding all kinds of people.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think it's a psychological, but it's also kind of like the physical. Is one of the biggest difficulties that a lot of autistics feel with the local parish is just a lot of autistics most of us have some kind of irregularity in our senses, not so much in the senses themselves, but in the processing of the senses in the brain. So how this often manifests is kind of a hypersensitivity where too much noise or too much sound can overwhelm the person very easily. And so even a normal parish mass can sometimes do that. So a lot of times, one of the questions I get, like I was talking, people send me messages online, and a lot of times it's like, well, how can I find a mass that doesn't cause sensory overload? And so that's one thing that I think, especially for the autistic community and also for some others that have issues like that, doing something where you have whether it's a sensory friendly mass, or it's kind of, some parish will have like the first mass in the morning, at 7:30 in the morning on Sunday. That's lower microphone.
It's like the quiet
mass,
the
low key mass, or even some parishes in, I don't know if you've done any here, but I know a number of across the country have started doing what like a reverse cry room, where they basically use the cry room to turn down the speakers there, turn down the lights there, so people who have sensory sensitivities can go in what most parishes use as the cry room for babies, at one or two of the masses, and then so they aren't overwhelmed. They can attend mass without issues in that regard.
I have friends that suffer from extreme social anxiety, for example, and for them just to go to a big Sunday mass just creates a tremendous amount of stress in their life, to the point where for long periods of time they didn't go to mass, or they'd go to maybe a weekday mass and sit in the back. But there's sometimes we try to force people to be more participative, or come up front, and sometimes there's a reason that person's sitting in the back pew, and we need to just respect that.
Oh, definitely, and I know, like with autism, there's a high comorbidity or concurrence of social anxiety or general anxiety as well, and so that can further that, and it's finding a way, trying to find a way that fits with everybody, and those type of things, so they can find a mass that. Maybe it is that 7:30 a.m. quiet mass, or maybe they go to mass at the the local contemplative convent where there's only 10 people behind the big wall where the nuns are.
Right.
So once you complete your dissertation for a doctorate, let's say that's not too far down the road, in doing a little bit of research about you, I thought there might be some interest in perhaps exploring some type of catechesis for people with primarily with autism. Is that something you're primarily thinking about in your future ministry?
Oh, definitely. I think that there's a lot of different ministries along those lines to help out people with autism, autistics. I don't have anything super specific right now. Like I was saying, I might be a professor, but a lot of times, professors often have side projects along those lines, and that would, I could very well see myself doing something like that in a few years. The next 2 years, I want to kind of, nose to the grindstone to finish my doctoral thesis by 2021. Otherwise, it's one of those things where if you don't focus, it can easily get drawn out and be like 4 years instead of 2 years, and then the provincial is on your case and things, and so that's. But I do think those type of things, and I think different things as far as even just simple things as far as how to hear confessions. I think sometimes people who are autistic will have, especially if they have kind of a social anxiety type thing, will have difficulty with confession. Whereas if the priest on the other side is also autistic, that would help them out a lot, so that it would probably make them much less anxious about it and things like that, which I think can be a help, so that those people can go to that sacrament without feeling like that overwhelming social anxiety or things.
So what advice can you provide us and all our listeners to help us to be more sensitive to the spiritual needs of people with autism and their families?
Well, the first thing I would say is to ask the individual and to find out what specifically they need, because sometimes it varies. Like we were saying, in the sense of some people are hypersensitive to light and bright lights and things, whereas I tend to be almost the opposite with light. Like my office, when I put in all the 5,000K lights, and everybody else is which are like the bright daylight lights, as opposed to kind of like the candle light or the soft white that most people generally prefer. And people who come into my office are like, wow, it's bright in here, and so sometimes there's an oddity in that, but it might be in either direction. And as well, to trust them when they say, okay, I get overwhelmed by this, or this caused a lot of social anxiety in me, or things like that, because we so often just think, that can't really be true. It's so easy to just kind of discount things. But when people are autistic, we tend to be very, very honest. It's hard for us to lie, harder for us than normal. So and so if something is difficult and we say it is, just, really trust that. Beyond that, I think things, in general, is just to not worry about things that don't seem to be willed. Like if the person is fidgeting, or the person comes off as a little rude. And things like we were talking about with sensitive masses and sensory sensitive masses and things like that, so that there isn't that overload. Because I think those are the biggest things that I think the church can do to help those who are on the spectrum to really fully live as members of the church.
Well, Father Matthew, thank you so much for joining us today to share your incredible journey and your ministry with all of us. Know that we'll continue to pray for you and the entire community of the Legionaries of Christ. And as always, whenever we have priests, and it goes to Bishop Hying as well, thank you for being a priest.
Yeah, kudos to you, Father, for your courage and honesty. It's a joy to have you on the show, and just prayers for your doctoral studies and in your ministry. And I think being open about your autism will certainly give other people permission to be open about theirs, and to know that God is at work in all that, and all of us have our challenges, have our crosses, and yet in the end we're all equal in God's love for us as His beloved children. So thank you.
Thank you, Bishop Hying. Yes, I think one of those things is just to realize God looks on us with love, and God made us with certain difficulties, and so. I write about a lot of this online. You just look autistic priest anywhere on the internet and you'll find it. It's pretty obvious.
Well, we wish all of you a very happy new year, and as always, thanks to all of you for listening. You are listening to Relevant Radio.
You've been listening to Diocese of Madison This Week. Tune in every Saturday at 11 a.m. and Sundays at 4 p.m. for the latest news and interviews from around the diocese here on Relevant Radio 1240 AM and 97.3 FM.